Okay, hi. Michael Denner here, professor of Russian Studies. This is an online lecture for my War and Peace seminar in the spring of 2023. And at this point, students should have reached volume 4 towards the end of War and Peace. So I wanted to talk about some themes in volume 4, and especially about one thing. And it's something that I've brought up several times in the course of teaching War and Peace the last few weeks. And it is a complicated topic. And it has to do with what I think Tolstoy is trying to say about human nature, about war, and about peace. And so I'm going to give myself about 15 or 20 minutes to try to talk through these themes and try to explain what I think Tolstoy is up to, some of his underlying beliefs about society and nature and animals and humans, specifically, obviously, about the characters inside of War and Peace. All right. I want you guys to think back to the very beginning of the novel. And I want you to think back to the soiree that begins the novel. Eh bien, mon prince, right? Remember the scene at Anna Pavlovna's, Annette's um, party parlor, and she has a bunch of people over, um, talking about, it's 1805, so they're talking about Bonaparte and about Bonaparte um, crowning himself emperor and becoming the leader of France. And of course, by volume 4, we've moved forward about 10 years in the novel, and it's 1812. We move forward 7 years in the novel, and Napoleon's army is about to enter Moscow in volume 4. But this is volume 1. This is 1,000 pages earlier. It's a long novel. And the novel kind of starts, and it starts in 1805. In fact, the title, when it was published, was 1805. Tolstoy had no idea at this point that he was going to write a novel, War and Peace, and people who were reading it had no idea that it was going to become a novel, and that the characters that they were meeting in 1861, when it first came out, would become part of this great Russian epic novel called War and Peace. They just thought it was the latest story by Graf Lev Tolstoy, by Count Leo Tolstoy, who was already by the 1860s an extraordinarily famous person in Russia. And we read some of his earlier short stories that he wrote in the 1850s. Okay, so we're back to this very beginning of War and Peace. The first things that we read. 1805, Anna Pavlovna's parlor, and I want to remind you of the way that the society, the peace part of War and Peace is depicted. And again, as always, I'm going to resist, push back, try to complicate any attempt to sort of deal in dichotomies with Tolstoy and say that there is war and then there is peace, and they're opposites, they're dichotomies, they're binaries. Tolstoy is way too good of a thinker for that kind of thing, and the more you pursue these ideas that there are antipodes, that there are opposites like war and peace, you find that peace starts to become war and war starts to become peace. It's very characteristic of Tolstoy, that he pushes ideas until they kind of come inside out like a sock. It's still the same sock, but now it looks very different because the outside is the in and the inside is the out. And this is very typical of Tolstoy. It's very Hegelian of Tolstoy. It's very philosophical of Tolstoy, and you find it in War and Peace. And I tried to show you guys how that works. How like the more that you approach war, and the more that you come to the margins of war, and you try to develop the idea of war, the more it seems that you start to talk about peace, and the same thing with peace. So I say all of this because I want you to think about the opening of War and Peace and about Anna Pavlovna's salon and the conversation, um, that that parlor is described in an extensive metaphor by Tolstoy as a mill, and in this mill there are mill like an old sewing factory, right? And in this mill there are spindles, and the spindles are carefully managed um, by Anna Pavlovna. That is to say, that we are supposed to understand the fundamental artificiality of the beginning of War and Peace and of the salon, the inside world of War and Peace, of Anna Pavlovna's soiree. Um, and then I want you to think about ways in which that extended metaphor of the parlor and the artificiality and the rule based world of Anna Pavlovna's parlor, and think of Tolstoy's depictions of war. This is what I meant earlier about how, as you pursue the extremes of war, you suddenly stumble into peace, and as you explore peace, you wander into the world of war. And this is very typical of Tolstoy. I just want to draw your attention. This will eventually develop into an argument, trust me, about the way that Tolstoy depicts the way things happen on the battlefield. Remember, there's always multiple views in Tolstoy, and you'll see the same scene over and over again from different perspectives. But I want you to think about the ways in which Tolstoy sort of mocks the idea that war is something that happens according to rules that Napoleon or Bagration or one of the other generals, they issue rules, and these orders are taken from HQ, and then they're delivered to the line, and the soldiers do right. And Tolstoy has nothing but impatience for that idea of war as a sort of a Clausewitzian, ordered, predictable, controllable world. And now I want you to think about his depiction of war and the artificiality of the idea that violence and war adheres to rules and policies and expectations, and to understand how that gets played out in the very beginning of War and Peace in Anna Pavlovna's soiree, where her parlor is depicted as a mill, that and right a factory with lots and lots of like engines and motors and wheels spinning at exactly the right rate so that everything happens at exactly the right time, and out comes a bolt of cloth. And so there is this idea in Tolstoy that we find again and again about the artificiality of the world that man creates, that is spun from a man's brain. And Tolstoy has no patience for this. He thinks it's a totally erroneous depiction of the way things really happen. And then we always get the way things really happen, and then Tolstoy plays up the the chaotic element of it, and depicts war as the fog of war. And we've talked endlessly about how Tolstoy understands that the battlefield, on the one hand, the generals and the officers believe in rules and regulations, and they believe in this sort of Anna Pavlovna's mill version of war, where you know generals come up with plans that are transmitted by captains to the soldiers, and the soldier, it's wrong. It's a fundamentally false way of depicting war that we buy. And you have to understand that the metaphor for war there is drawn directly from peace. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that as you pursue these dichotomies and these contradictions, things that seem to be radically opposed, war on one hand, peace on the other, and you pursue them long enough and you find yourself, it's like you've gone around all the way around the world. And like you go east so long that you end up going west with Tolstoy. And uh, Tolstoy deconstructs, he explodes these definitions. Okay, so I want to establish this idea that for Tolstoy, and again, remember how wary I am of talking about Tolstoy and dichotomies, but here I'm going to kind of indulge a little bit in it just for the sake of a lecture that's at least partially coherent. And you have this idea in Tolstoy that's deeply, deeply embedded in Tolstoy, and we could talk about Tolstoy in like 1856, and we could talk about Tolstoy in 1896, and the continuity of this idea. And it goes something like this: that what appears to be the natural state of things is, in fact, not at all the natural state of things, but a human imposed systemic, largely artificial version of the world. This sort of this becomes this beginning, this idea about the artificiality, the constructedness of of life, of what seems normal. This is a thread that runs very, very, very deeply in Tolstoy's later metaphysical, mystical, religious works. Uh, um, we began the class, you'll recall, in January, reading the story called After the Ball. And I drew your attention to how chaos, the way that the world is portrayed in the last half of the story, it's not the opposite of order. It's not the the, the martial, warlike part of After the Ball is not opposed to the ball. It's not the ball and war. It's that war cannot exist without the facade of the dance, and that the dance is itself always already war, and that the punishment of the Tatar at the end of After the Ball is itself also a highly choreographed artificial dance. All right, so we've established this idea that in War and Peace, and we see it over and over again, that there is this very artificial, frozen, constructed world, and behind that world exists a more authentic, more real, yet more chaotic and less human world. You have this opposition between the world of human, and we have to understand that in Tolstoy's world, that human is highly artificial. It's the ball and After the Ball. But behind the facade of the ball is the real, more authentic world of, I don't know, we could call it chaos or violence. And here I want to call it animal. And now we talk about the topic I really want to talk about with all of War and Peace, but in particular part 4 of War and Peace. And I want you to understand that um, that there is a, I don't know, political philosophy, moral philosophy that Tolstoy is pursuing in War and Peace. And he pursues it in lots of different ways. He pursues it quite explicitly in his long essays about history. But I want to point out that he also pursues this ultimately political view of the world in his depictions, in his fictional depictions in War and Peace, of Pierre and Natasha and the Rostovs and the Rostov home and the shed where Pierre lives after Moscow is burned, and 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 the home of the Balkonskys. All of these things, like they exist as real things and Tolstoy's depictions of them, but they also have a sort of metaphorical value to them, and it's more than symbolism or something quite simplistic like that. Again, you have to remember that Tolstoy is a genius, and he's not going to fall into these simple traps of like light means God or something like that, right? It's always really complicated. All right, so now let's think a little bit about the animal in War and Peace, and I'm going to start off by pointing out that almost all of the characters in War and Peace, they sort of have an animal spirit that roars out at moments. And I'll start with the very, very beginning of War and Peace, and I'll remind you of a scene, and I'm marking my memory here. It's in the first 30 or 40 pages, and Julie Kuragin, who is visiting Julie Kuragin, um, she, she's the one who falls in love with Nikolai. Uh, she only speaks French. Oh, she's Marie's correspondent, and she's a Karagin, and there's the Kuragins. That's a different family. Man, War and Peace is confusing. All right, remember Julie? We don't like her. She's really really artificial. And the letters that she writes to Marie are terrible. And the old prince Balkonsky immediately understands that. But anyway, it's the very beginning of the novel. And again, remember, nobody knows. Tolstoy doesn't know. The readers don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen. You don't know. I do. I've read the novel 10 times. So I would recall this scene. And Julie is in the parlor at the Rostovs, and she's talking in French. And you have to imagine this is the world that Tolstoy hates. It's the world of the aristocratic parlor, and it's like drinking tea with your pinky up, and everybody's saying these bon mots, these very clever things. And Tolstoy always hated that world, and so he has Natasha erupt into the world. It's almost like the, like Julie speaking French and trying to be so civilized evokes, calls forth Natasha. And Natasha's like 13 at this time. She's a little kid. And she's got this doll jammed into her dress, if you'll recall. And she bursts into the room and disrupts everything. And this is Natasha's sort of like, this is what joins Natasha with Pierre. They're both disruptors. They both walk into rooms, and all of a sudden the order collapses because they've walked into the room. And so this is Natasha, and she's just a kid, and she's described as a goat. and and throughout the novel, Natasha is repeatedly called a goat. Read the novel, you'll see it happens over and over again. A few pages earlier, it's the end of the soiree at Anna Pavlovna's. And so this is the scene. You remember that Andrei walks in, and he's all haughty, and he pisses everybody off, and he doesn't care. And we meet his young wife, who dies a little bit later, the little princess with her little lip. And Tolstoy hates all of this. You have to understand that like Tolstoy he has nothing but scorn for this artificial world. Um, and Pierre is there. And Pierre, again, like Natasha, is a disruptor. He walks into this salon where everybody's talking about Bonaparte and all of these princes and all these fancy people are all speaking French. And Pierre, who by the way is of course fluent in French, he's lived his entire life in France. He just sort of bursts in to this salon, and Anna Pavlovna, who can't control him, is so embarrassed. And she does everything that she can. Like hey Pierre, have you talked to the old lady over there in the corner? She does everything that she can to get Pierre out of the room. And Pierre's really like Tolstoy really loves Pierre. We all love Pierre. He's a disruptor. And he doesn't really understand the careful codes and rules that govern Anna Pavlovna's soiree. And so he just walks up to people and he glad hands them, and he's like, "Isn't Napoleon great?" Blah, blah. And after it, Anna Pavlovna pulls aside Prince Vasily. And remember, Prince Vasily, he is Helene's father. Anatole's father, Hippolyte's father. Tolstoy has nothing but scorn for the Kuragins, and Vasily is the paterfamilia of the Kuragins. And Anna Pavlovna, who also is like a despicable character, pulls Vasily aside, and she says to him, "Образуйте мне этого медведя." What could you educate that bear? She's referring to Pierre for me, and make something of him. And of course, Vasily like immediately is like, oh, he's rich, and I have a daughter. And remember, Anatole and Hélène, they're sort of like a little too close. And she's like, I know how I can solve this problem. So he eventually he manipulates Pierre, and eventually gets Pierre to marry Hélène. But here, I want to point out that we have another animal erupting. It's the bear, and the bear becomes a very important thing in the novel. You'll recall that Pierre and Dolokhov get decommissioned because they get drunk later that night, and they tie a policeman to a bear. Bears appear throughout the novel, but the bear in the novel is Pierre. He's a bear. He's a huge guy who's always awkward and always breaking things, and is impressive for his disdain, and actually not even disdain, ignorance of human convention. And you remember when he's in the shed, he's been arrested, and he's almost been shot, and then he gets thrown in a shed with a bunch of peasants, and he wins their favor because the peasants have never seen an aristocrat like Pierre. Pierre is an impressive aristocrat. You recall he's so big and strong that he can push nails into wood using just his fingers. So that must be an exaggeration. Nobody could possibly be that strong. But here we go. Like Pierre, you have to understand Pierre as this supernatural creature. He has a spirit self, just like Natasha is a goat, just like Natasha is constantly running and disturbing things and overturning things. Pierre is the bear. These characteristics, they're not every character in War and Peace. I should point out, like not every character in War and Peace has this spirit animal. Like one cannot imagine Hélène, for instance, having a spiritual animal. She is completely artificial. She's described as a statue over and over again. Like she can't have an animal identity because she's all human. I'll come back to this idea. We couldn't imagine Prince Vasily, like, oh my God, having a human. Now he's this cold, calculating, manipulating. He understands the rules better than anyone. We remember that he tries to steal Pierre's fortune, and he almost gets away with it. He's the essential diplomat. He knows and manipulates, but follows rules. Napoleon, another character. It's impossible to imagine Napoleon having a spiritual, an animal self. But let's think like I don't want to spend too much time with this, but like Sonia is constantly depicted as and actually called repeatedly Koshka, a cat. It is Sonia. And again, this is this fascinating idea. It's wrong to think that Natasha is goat-like, or Pierre is bear-like, or Sonia is cat-like. It is way more complicated than that. It is as though the animal shimmers through in this romantic philosophical idea of shimmering. Heidegger talks a lot about shimmering, and like it's like they're wearing a costume, and the costume is their human appearance, but inside of them, inside of the costume, is the animal, and it's like the animal that gives it volume. This is very metaphorical, but I really want like it's not like Natasha is like a goat. It's like The essence of Natasha is goat-like. I'll give you one more example, and then I'll move on. There's a character whom you should really love, and it's Denisov. And I'll just remind you that Denisov is Nikolai Rostov's best friend. He's a little bit older. Uh, he falls in love. Who wouldn't, with Natasha, and he proposes marriage to her. He's the one who gets in trouble with the military because he makes too much of a theft, and he brings shame on his battalion. He's not a major character, but it seems like Denisov is one of the only characters who makes an appearance in book one and is still with us in book four. And now let's talk about Denisov and his animal nature and his role in book four. In one of the saddest scenes in War and Peace, in the fourth volume, Peter Petya, the little brother of Nikolai, the little brother of Natasha, the son of the Rostovs, uh, gets killed. You remember, it's a terrible scene. It's very short, and all that Petya has ever wanted to do is to be a soldier, and he wants to stab people, and he imagines all of this glory, and instead, his very first mission, and he's with Denisov, and he's with Dolokhov, and they're chasing down the remnants of La Grande Armée. The French have given up Moscow, and now they're fleeing and dying quickly in the Russian winter in late 1812. And Petya finally, I think he's maybe 15 or 16 years old at this point, and Dolokhov and Denisov bring him along, and he doesn't listen, and he doesn't obey commands, and he goes galloping into this French camp, and he gets shot and killed. And it's a terrible scene. And this is eventually what destroys the Rostov family. But fascinatingly, also it's also what kind of saves Natasha, and she comes out of her grief. I don't want to talk about that right now, but it's so. But he and now I want to remind you about that scene and something in particular about it. Dolokhov, I'm sorry, Denisov, he's the soldier, the one I talked about, the one that is the best friends with Nikolai, proposed to Natasha. And he appears in the first volume, and he appears in the fourth volume. And at this point, he and Dolokhov have teamed up. You kind of see that, saw that coming, right? And they're picking off the French as the French are fleeing. And Petya Rostov is there, trying to reprise his brother's role, and he gets killed. And something happens. Denisov goes, and he sees Petya Rostov lying on the ground, and he knows what's going to happen, and he walks up to the corpse, and and I'm gonna read. He staggers up to Petya Rostov, shot by the French, and the Cossacks, and this is a quote from the novel, and the Cossacks glanced around in surprise at the sounds, similar to a dog's barking, with which Denisov quickly turned away, went to the fence, and caught hold of it. It's a great scene. I'm going to draw attention here. It's an example of how our animal nature shines forth in extremis in these moments of great stress and violence and instability and chaos. And Denisov barks like a dog when he sees that Petya has been killed. Here's the fascinating thing, Tolstoy's so good. He's prepared for this scene for 1,000 pages. If you look back, read back, think back, Denisov is always described as a dog. He's constantly described with these adjectives in Russian, Mahnati, Lakhmati, Chirnovolasati. Yeah, they're not even real words. Tolstoy kind of made them up, but they're all about how hairy Denisov is. Remember, he's embarrassed by how much hair he has, and he's loyal like a dog, and he's constantly referred to. If you look and you read and you're aware of these things and you look for him, he's constantly referred to as the dog. And like 1,000 pages later, like that dog erupts out of Denisov and at the site of Ilya Rostov's dead body. Okay, so now I've sort of established this idea that many of the characters, though not all of the characters, have their, and again, I think it's hard to come up with a description because we don't really have words to describe what Tolstoy is doing. But I want to say something like, many of the characters in War and Peace are actually animals wearing human costumes. You get the perversity of that, right? It's not people wearing animal costumes, but for Tolstoy, the real, actual, authentic, such an important word for Tolstoy, human nature is animalian. And what we think of as our humanness is artificial. And I want to draw all these things together and point out that given these priors that Tolstoy has about the artificiality of peace, the artificiality of the drawing room, of aristocratic life, of the rules, of the spindles in Anna Pavlovna's parlor, and his rejection of that world, although it's way more complicated than that, his rejection of that world and his opposition to that world, of the world of, and ready, of war and chaos and Russia and, I want to say, masculinity. Okay, I'll say two words. I don't want to get into this, but like, there is deeply embedded in this novel a lot about gender roles. I guess I'll say it's not a 21st century concept. It's not a 20th century concept. Tolstoy was talking about gender in the 19th century. That's first. Two, it's always not simple. As we know, it's gender, and it's always complicated. And in Tolstoy, one finds very often that men become women and women become men. Like literally in some cases. Like, for example, you'll recall that Natasha and Sonia in the mumming scenes in volume 3, it's Christmas time, and they're at home on the Rostovs. They dress up as Circassian soldiers. They put mustaches on and they carry swords. And you'll also recall that in the hunt scene, which is also in volume 3, we find out, oddly, that there is a man who dresses like a woman who lives at the Rostov mansion, and he accompanies Ilya Rostov on the hunt. So right. So throughout this novel, we find men who act like women and women who act like men who are transformed into women, and we realize that, like the 20th century and the 21st century philosophy, gender in Tolstoy is not something that is biological. It's not rot. It's not sex in that sense of male and female. It's masculine roles and feminine roles. And Tolstoy is a person who spends a lot of time later on thinking about and writing about gender roles. And I don't want to talk about it here, but like the War and Peace, there's a highly gendered element, and peace is gendered as feminine, although it has many women and many men in it. And war is gendered as masculine. although it has many women, and many men in it. And so there is a gendered opposition where uh, peace is coded feminine and war is coded masculine. So, and now I want to say very, very little because I really don't want to get bogged down in these. But there's something going on that's deeply nationalistic in War and Peace, and it involves um, an opposition of the West and the East, of European and Russian, of French and Russian, of Napoleon and Kutuzov. Um, it is in this novel, and it can be called a sort of nationalistic view of what it means to be Russian and what it means to be Western. And in this War and Peace, in this novel, I've already talked about how we have these oppositions between war and peace, between the battlefield with its chaos and the parlor with its rules. And adding to this, we could add to these antinomies, to these opposites, to these pairs, the idea that War and Peace depicts the West and the East, depicts Napoleon, the consummate West, and the Russian response to the invasion of Russia by the West and the attempt to impose Western values on something that Tolstoy clearly sees as fundamentally opposed to the West, and he codes that as Russian. And why do the Russians win against the war in the War of 1812 against all odds? Why can they give up Moscow and still win? Why can they chase the French all the way back to Paris in 1812? It's because of the ethnolinguistic superiority of the Russians. And now we've really entered into an area that I don't really want to talk a lot about because it will distract you from other things in the novel that I think are equally important. But it clearly also applies, obviously, deeply and immediately to the current war in Ukraine, between the idea, well, but the Putin's claim that the war was caused by Western encroachment on what had traditionally been Russian lands. And I don't want to comment on this, but that after reading War and Peace, I think that a student will have a more nuanced understanding of why Russia might have a historical uh, bruise or injury regarding Western invasions into Russia and the imposition of Western values on what Russians see as a set of values that is fundamentally opposed to the West. Anyway, you see this in War and Peace. Okay, last thing. Um, there comes a point where I think it is correct to say that the political argument that Tolstoy is making is something like we are our most human, our most authentic in those moments when, as a reaction to rules and order, in reaction to peace, chaos emerges. In reaction to Julie Kouragin and her small talk in French in the Rostov parlor, you, like a magician, call forth, evoke the goat, Natasha Rostov, and the bear, Pierre wanders through Anna Pavlovna's salon, and Denisov sheds his humanity and displays his animal spirit, his dog, at the sight of the tragic death of Petya Rostov. And so there's this argument that goes something like, our animalian nature is more human than our human nature. And I want to end this with reading an extended quote from part 4 It's a very famous quote about Moscow right after the French had left it. Anybody who reads this, who reads War and Peace, knows this quote. It's very famous. It's called like the Moscow as anthill scene. And I'm just going to read it. And I want you to think about animals and humans and war and peace and West and East and chaos and order and Tolstoy. And as I read this quote, this is from part 4. Just as it is hard to explain why and where ants hurry to and from a demolished anthill, some away from the anthill carrying specks of dust, eggs, and dead bodies, and others back to the anthill, why they run into each other, hurry past one another, scramble over one another. So it would be hard to explain the reasons that made the Russian people, after the departure of the French, crowd into the place which was formerly called Moscow. But just as, when looking at the ants scattered around the destroyed anthill, despite its complete obliteration, one can see by the tenacity, the energy, the countless numbers of the swarming insects, that everything has been destroyed except for something indestructible, immaterial, which made for the whole force of the anthill. So Moscow in the month of October, despite the fact that there were no authorities, no churches, no holy objects, no wealth, no houses, was the same Moscow it had been in August. Everything was destroyed except for something immaterial but mighty and indestructible. There we have it. There's the sort of the animal essence. The Tolstoy calls it the royavaya жизнь, the swarm-like life that is the true life of humanity. Okay, that's it. I'm done. I'll post a question about this lecture. I'm sorry, as always, I rambled, but I really like talking about War and Peace. Peace. See you next week.